Babylon's Banksters. Alchemy, Physics, Finance, Religion. Babylon's Banksters. The Alchemy of Deep Physics, High Finance, and Ancient Religion. Babylon's Banksters. The Alchemy of Deep Physics, High Finance, and Ancient Religions by Joseph P. Farrell. You're listening to World Reading Club, presented by Hakeem Alibokas Alexander on Spreaker, Social Podcasting, and Wisdom, Social Audio Inc., presented for World Reading Club in association with ExercisingYourMind.com and UniquilibriuM. The Alchemy of Deep Physics, High Finance, and Ancient Religion by Joseph P. Farrell is an essay concerning the relationships between ether physics, economics, astrology, alchemy, geomancy, ancient temples, and the politics of suppression. Should be very interesting. It starts off with and this book was 2010. It starts off with a quote here. It says, "Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come, and the merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buyeth their merchandise any more. The merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones, and of pearls and fine linen, and purple and silk and scarlet, all thine wood, and all manner vessels of ivory, and all manner vessels of most precious wood, and of brass, and iron, and marble, and cinnamon, and odors, and ointments, and frankincense, and wine, and oil, and fine flour, and wheat, and beasts, and sheep, and horses, and chariots, and slaves, and souls of men. And the fruits that thy soul lusted after are departed from thee, and all things which were dainty and goodly are departed from thee, and thou shalt find them no more at all. The merchants of these things, which were made rich by her, shall stand afar off for the fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen, and purple and scarlet, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in 1 hour so great riches is come to naught. And every shipmaster, and all the company in ships and sailors, and as many as trade by sea, stood afar off, and when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What city is like unto this great city? And they cast dust on their heads, and cried, weeping and wailing, saying, Alas, alas, that great city, wherein were made rich all that had ships in the sea by reason of her costliness. For in 1 hour she is made desolate." That's from the Revelation of St. John, 18 verses 10 through 19. Hello, wandering fool. As a dedication to Scott Douglas DeHart, anything I could say, any gratitude I could express is simply inadequate to you. And for Tracy S. Fisher, you are and will always be sorely missed. And to Richard C. Hoagland, in thanks for many wonderful insights, stimulating thoughts, splendid conversations, and scintillating analysis. And to George Ann Hughes, true and generous in your prayers and support. He who has found such as these has found treasures. Acknowledgements. As always, I'd like to thank Mr. Richard C. Hoagland for contributions to this book. Oh, by the way, I know of Richard C. Hoagland's book. There's one called, it's called, Secret Mission, and something about like or is it? No, it's called Dark Mission, something like that. The Secret NASA or something like that. Chris, speaking of NASA, what's up, Chris? So Richard C. Hoagland, for contributions in this book. In this case, unbeknownst to Mr. Hoagland, I had determined to write a book on this subject a couple of years ago, and one of those synchronicities that seemed to be a common feature of modern life, while listening to one of his presentations at a conference, a source for research utilized and cited herein was mentioned. Needless to say, I quickly jotted down the reference, and eventually, when I purchased the book, found it to be a goldmine of information and thought-provoking ideas. The book was astrologist Robert Gover's Time and Money, the Economy and the Planets. Notwithstanding the short view of it in the main text, is in itself a book worth considering in its totality for those interested in the more esoteric aspects of economic forecasting activity. Mr. Hoagland also played another role in the formation of this book, and again, it was one that at the time he didn't realize he was playing. During a visit to his home in 2008, Mr. Hoagland showed me volumes of data in his library that had been collected and analyzed by the little-known Foundation for the Study of Cycles. We had some stimulating conversation over these materials, not the least of which were their implications for the connection between physics and finance. In due course, I set off researching the availability of some of this material and eventually was able to purchase the classic text Cycles, The Science of Prediction, by the Foundation's founder, economist Edward Dewey. In researching this book, I quickly discovered that the materials to document the main themes were so numerous and varied that any attempt at comprehensiveness was futile. Notwithstanding that, a word of thanks to all those inventors and scientists who have seen their discoveries and theories shuffled to the sidelines by a corporatocracy that is hell-bent on keeping humanity in the slavery of an energy and financial dark ages. To all the Teslas, Farnsworths, Kozyrevs, Muellers, Richters, De Palmers, Bedinis, and Beardens out there, thank you. I only regret that I couldn't mention you all, but rest assured your work and its implications were noticed. And to all the other researchers out there who have contributed in masking the sinister role of private banking in the affairs of state and of mankind throughout history, thank you. Again, it was not for the dearth, but the surfeit of information that specific mention could only be made of a few of you. And with that, on to the story. Joseph P. Farrell in Spearfish, South Dakota, 2009. Preface. Prologue is epilogue, or Two Flies in the Ointment, Communist China and Nazi Germany. Quote, the relationship between two assets can never be captured by a single scalar quantity. Financial analyst Paul Wilmot. A. Confronting the beast. Modern fiat money and reserve banking is indeed a manifestation of the transmutative nothingness of the philosopher's stone, for from the creation of credit out of nothing, gold is produced. By nationalizing that money and credit-creating institution and wresting it from private secretive hands and using it to fund the alchemical physics, it was beginning to develop as the ultimate energy source, as the ultimate power to transport mankind, and the ultimate power for destruction on a doomsday scale. The Nazis indicated that they had understood the nature of the philosopher's stone. They had seen and fully understood the connection between alchemical physics and alchemical finance, and they were willing to put it to supremely evil uses. But that connection between alchemical physics and alchemical finance is, perhaps, a relationship that requires its own exposition. Epilogue is prologue. Thus did I write at the conclusion of my book, The Philosopher's Stone, Alchemy and the Secret Research for Exotic Matter. The reader may have inferred from these quoted remarks that there was much more of the story, both from the standpoint of physics and finance, and from that of history, to tell, and that it would require yet another study or book to do so. If the reader made such inferences, he is correct on both counts. There is much more of the story of the relationship between physics and finance to tell. The thesis of this book is both simple to state and difficult to understand, and that is that since ancient times, and with more or less uninterrupted constancy, there has existed an international money power which seeks by a variety of means, including fraud, deception, assassination, and war, to usurp the money and credit-creating power of the various states it has sought to dominate, and to obfuscate and occult the profound connection between that money-creating power and the deep alchemical physics that such power implies. Accordingly, I do not argue that case comprehensively in this book. To do so would require an extended series of books, each devoted to a particular historical period, and each burying the reader in a blizzard of footnotes to the extent that the main thesis would itself become obscured. Rather, I assume this model as a given, as an interpretive paradigm by which to view certain events and data. In so doing, that case is indeed argued, but in synoptic form rather than comprehensively. In doing so, I hope to keep before the reader's attention that deep found connection between physics and finance, and to show why it is that the private and international money power must always seek to suppress not only certain types of state financial policy, but also certain types of physics, for both indeed spring from a common conceptual root. Most of my books, as readers familiar with them already know, inhabit a strange region where alternative physics interfaces with history to reveal the latter's hidden motivations, secrets, and players. This book is no different, save for the fact that I have obviously added a new conceptual layer, or player, that is, finance and economics. And along the way, we shall encounter other major conceptual scenery that readers of my books have encountered before: alchemy, astrology, astronomy, torsion, Egypt, Babylon, Nazis, ancient text and tomes, and modern mathematical gurus speaking the arcane language of statistical and topological lore. In fact, one of those odd synchronicities that seemed to increase in modern life as this book was being researched and written, decades, if not centuries or even millennia, of corruption and intellectual flaccidity in the financial, banking, and corporate sectors of the world came to an ugly head with the collapse of the housing and derivatives bubble and the appearance of some of those responsible for the meltdown before the United States House of Representatives, hands extended, asking for a bailout of their malfeasance and irresponsibility at the expense of the American taxpayer, and demanding no oversight to boot, as if they were being forced to pay some hidden blackmailer and were afraid that oversight might disclose this fact. But why call it irresponsibility and not simply criminality? In the answer to that question there lies a tale, and it is a tale I did not originally intend to go into when I conceived the plan for this series of books many years ago, much less the plan for this one. Recent financial events, however, have contrived to place the story I intended to tell after completing the Nazi International and the Philosopher's Stone into a rather different context. As will become apparent to the reader in the main text, I do believe there is a criminality and conspiracy involved in the story of the complex relationship of physics and finance throughout. And paradoxically, the farther back one pursues this relationship, the closer together physics, finance, and all those other themes enunciated above as the conceptual scenery draw together, and the more apparent the odor of a long-standing conspiracy becomes. But in and of itself, the contemporary financial meltdown is both a story of conspiracy as well as a case of galloping stupidity and colossal intellectual, political, and economic irresponsibility proportional to the aforesaid stupidity. It is nonetheless a story with its own deep connections to the story of the main text, and it is as good an entry into the subject as any. So, as a way of entering into the discussion of the themes that preoccupy the main text, one may examine two salient modern examples that arose to challenge the reigning financial and physical assumptions of that money power. Those examples are Communist China and Nazi Germany. B. Meltdown or message? 1. David Lee's formula. This most contemporary character of this very long and ancient story began when a Chinese mathematician, Dr. David X. Lee, came up with a formula that seemed a godsend to Wall Street City of London financial manipulators. The formula, known to most economists and mathematical analysts with major banking houses, is unfamiliar to most, but like Einstein's E equals mc squared, it is destined to become famous in history for the influence it had on human actions and politics. Y'all in Wisdom and Spreaker land can't see it, but he says here what it looks like, and I'm not even going to read it right now. But it's a medium-sized equation. It's got a couple brackets and parentheses there. But we're going to go on here. Li, who grew up in rural China in the 1960s, eventually earned a master's degree in economics at Nankai University and then left China to pursue an MBA from Laval University in Quebec, a master's degree in actuarial science, and a PhD in statistics from the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. By 1997, Dr. Li had landed at Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, later moving to Barclays Capital in 2004. But what did the formula exactly mean? What did it do? Felix Salmon summarizes the effect of the formula in a brilliant article, A Formula for Disaster, in the March 2009 issue of Wired magazine. Li took a notoriously tough nut, determining correlation or how seemingly disparate events are related, and cracked it wide open with a simple and elegant mathematical formula, one that would become ubiquitous in finance worldwide. For 5 years, Li's formula, known as a Gaussian copula function, looked like an unambiguously positive breakthrough, a piece of financial technology that allowed hugely complex risks to be modeled with more ease and accuracy than ever before. With his brilliant spark of financial legerdemain, Li made it possible for traders to sell vast quantities of new securities, expanding financial markets to unimaginable levels. His method, by everybody from bond investors and Wall Street banks to ratings agencies and regulators, and it became so deeply entrenched and was making people so much money that warnings about its limitations were largely ignored. Then the model fell apart. Cracks started appearing early on when financial markets began behaving in ways that users of Li's formula hadn't expected. The cracks became full-fledged canyons in 2008, when ruptures in the financial system's foundation swallowed up trillions of dollars and put the survival of the global banking system in serious peril. Li's Gaussian copula formula will go down in history as instrumental in causing the unfathomable losses that brought the world financial system to its knees. But again, what precisely did the formula do, and how did it do it? How did it cause the financial meltdown? The key lies precisely in that important word, correlation. Li's formula seemed to make sense of the thousands of moving parts, interlocked economic system. Salmon illustrates what Li's formula did via a simple analogy. To understand the mathematics of correlation better, consider something simple, like a kid in an elementary school. Let's call her Alice. The probability that her parents will get divorced this year is about 5%. The risk of her getting head lice is about 5%. The chance of her seeing a teacher slip on a banana peel is about 5%. And the likelihood of her winning the class spelling bee is about 5%. If investors were trading securities based on the chances of those things happening only to Alice, they would all trade at more or less the same price. But something important happens when we start to look at two kids rather than one. Not just Alice, but also the girl she sits next to, Brittany. If Brittany's parents get divorced, what are the chances that Alice's parents will get divorced too? Still about 5%. The correlation there is close to zero. But if Brittany gets head lice, the chance that Alice will get head lice is much higher, about 50%, which means the correlation is probably up in the 0.5% range. If Brittany sees a teacher slip on a banana peel, what is the chance that Alice will see it too? Very high indeed, since they sit next to each other. It could be as much as 95%, which means the correlation is close to 1. And if Brittany wins the class spelling bee, the chance of Alice winning is 0, which means the correlation is -1. If investors were trading securities based on the chances of these things happening to both Alice and Brittany, the prices would be all over the place because the correlations varied so much. What's up, Sarita? Sarah! Now, factor in thousands, even millions of individuals and thousands of interlocking correlated conditions. Energy prices, building and housing costs, money and credit supply, and so on. And one gets the idea of the complexity of the system of correlations and the beguiling simplicity of Dr. Lee's formula. The reason its simplicity was so beguiling is in itself rather simple, as Salmon puts it in his article. It's a very inexact science. Just measuring those initial 5% probabilities involves collecting lots of disparate data points and subjecting them to all manner of statistical and error analysis. Trying to assess the conditional probabilities, the chance that Alice will get head lice, if Brittany gets head lice, is an order of magnitude harder, since those data points are much rarer. As a result of the scarcity of historical data, the errors there are likely to be much greater. Bear that point about the need for historical data in mind, for it not only plays a significant role immediately below in the methodological assumptions of Dr. Lee and his formula, but it will play an even more important role in Chapter 2. It is regarding this point of historical data, or rather the assumed lack thereof, that Dr. Lee's formula way out of the impasse, or so it seemed at the time. Using some relatively simple math, by Wall Street standards anyway, Lee came up with an ingenious way to model default correlation without even looking at the historical default data. Instead, he used market data about the prices of instruments known as credit default swaps. In other words, within Lee's elegant statistical copula formula lies a hidden methodological assumption, namely, that historical data on credit default rates could be safely jettisoned in favor of an immediate concentration on the current market prices of credit default swaps. As we shall see in Chapter 2, there was a great deal of historical data available, and that data in turn pointed to a deep physics of financial cycles that few economists, or even physicists for that, scarcely guess at, and even fewer knew existed at all. We are getting ahead of ourselves. What exactly are credit default swaps? This is where the story of Lee's formula gets very interesting, and Salmon explains what they are with clear concision. If you're an investor, you have a choice these days. You can either lend directly to borrowers or sell investors' credit default swaps, insurance against those same borrowers defaulting. Either way, you get a regular income stream, interest payments or insurance payments. And either way, if the borrower defaults, you lose a lot of money. The returns on both strategies are nearly identical, but because an unlimited number of credit default swaps can be sold against each borrower, the supply of swaps isn't constrained the way the supply of bonds is. So the CDS, or credit default swap market, managed to grow extremely rapidly. Though credit default swaps were relatively new when Lee's paper came out, they soon became a bigger and more liquid market than the bonds on which they were based. Enter Dr. Lee, for his formula was nothing more than a model that used price rather than real-world default data as a shortcut, making it an implicit assumption that financial markets in general, and CDS markets in particular, can price default risk correctly. Salmon explains Lee's techniques by mincing no words. It was a brilliant simplification of an intractable problem, and Lee didn't just radically dumb down the difficulty of working out correlations. He decided not to even bother trying to map and calculate all the nearly infinite relationships between the various loans that make up a pool. What happens when the number of pool members increases, or when you mix negative correlations with positive ones? Never mind all that, he said. The only thing that matters is the final correlation number. One clean, simple, all-sufficient figure that sums up everything. Lee had reduced it to a simple dimensionless number, scalar in mathematicians' terms. Then in its simplicity, or that in its simplicity cast a beguiling spell over the world's financial securities and securities market. Lee had reduced the problem to a simple dimensionless number, a scalar in mathematicians' terms, that its simplicity cast a beguiling spell over the world's financial and securities market. Indeed, the formula's effect was almost immediate and electric because Wall Street's financial gurus, armed with Lee's formula, deduced from it a new world of possibilities. And the first thing they did was start creating brand new AAA securities. Using Lee's copula approach meant that ratings agencies like Moody's or anybody wanting to model the risk of a bundle of securities no longer needed to puzzle over the underlying securities. All they needed was the correlation number, and out would come a rating telling them how safe or risky the bundle was. Pause here for a second. You know, in a book more recent than this one, this is Babylon's Banksters, right? I actually read about this in somebody I've been following since 1997, which is Robert Kiyosaki, and I happen to have the book right next to me, which is called Capitalist Manifesto by Robert Kiyosaki, of course, the author of the bestseller Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which he made lots of interesting predictions, but he mentioned that about how Moody's, which is owned by one of the companies by Warren Buffett, how he blessed these subprime loans as being prime, which is what they just said right here, right? Using Coppola's approach meant that ratings agencies like Moody's or anybody wanting to model the risk of a bundle of securities no longer needed to puzzle over the underlying securities, right? See, what he says before that is the first thing they did was start creating brand new AAA securities, meaning they blessed them as being prime, right? And he mentions that about Warren Buffett. And even Warren Buffett, he even said things before, like he called them weapons of financial mass destruction or something like that, which is crazy. This book, The Capitalist Manifesto by Robert Kiyosaki, was published in 2021, right? So I'm starting to connect a lot of these dots here that I have been on an interesting track with all of this because these authors and many of, well, at least Robert Kiyosaki, a multimillionaire, is interesting in saying some of these things that now I'm seeing repeated in some of these conspiracy theorist texts by people like Joseph P. Farrell. So earlier today, actually, when I met up for the second time at Barnes & Noble's with Christopher Birkenbein, we were talking about that, about the interesting thing about conspiracy theories and stuff like that, about how whether they be true or not, it can be very captivating because of the fact of how much research they use and how much they dig into historical facts and things like that, and how Christopher said, I may not agree with their conclusions, but it's interesting that they bring to the surface a lot of things that you might not normally pull out on yourself, like sometimes some obscure things like I think that even Mr. Farrell in his book might be correct that some of these things that Christopher, who has a degree in applied physics and is a scientist who also works as a project manager with NASA, might not have heard of, right? Because, of course, just because you work in a certain industry or have a degree in something like physics doesn't mean that you hear about everything in physics. Or like if you're in finance, like nowhere ever did Robert Kiyosaki in any of these books that I ever read, all of the ones written solely by him and also two of them in conjunction with Donald Trump, has he ever mentioned David X. Lee or his equation and how it affected the economy. But they do mention other things in common. And yeah, I don't see, man, he's got a lot of stuff in this book, The Capitalist Manifesto by Robert Kiyosaki. But I won't go digging too deep. I was just looking to see if I could find that thing where he talks about Warren Buffett and how Warren Buffett talked about certain things, certain securities as weapons of mass financial destruction or something like that, or financial mass destruction, something like that. But I'm sure I'll pull it together at some other time. I like the way that Mr. Joseph P. Farrell writes. It's very dramatic, and it makes for a good story. So let us continue this deep dive in Babylon's Banksters, the alchemy of deep physics, high finance, and ancient religion. All right, so continuing. As a result, just about anything could be bundled and turned into AAA bond, corporate bonds, bank loans, mortgage-backed securities, whatever you liked. The consequent pools were often known as collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs. You could bundle that pool and create a AAA security, even if none of the components themselves were themselves AAA. You could even take lower-rated bundles of other CDOs, put them in a pool, and bundle them, an instrument known as a CDO squared. The point was so far removed from any actual underlying bond or loan or mortgage that no one really had a clue what it included, but it didn't matter. All you needed was copula function. In other words, the effect of Dr. Lee's formula was to abandon the focus on the relative strength and risk of each component, since they were now so interlocked via the copula itself, and this in turn led to an explosion of more and more bundles of securities and credit swaps, and even to bundles of bundles. As a result of this increasing interlock and correlation, the CDOs and CDO markets grew together, feeding on each other. At the end of 2001, there was $920 billion in credit default swaps outstanding. By the end of 2007, that number had skyrocketed to more than 62 trillion. Wow, from 920 billion to 62 trillion? That's insanity. That's what the hell? That's a little bit more than 62 times it grew. Yeah, because 920 billion is just like a little, 80 billion off from being a trillion. So multiply that times 62 and you get 62 trillion. Jeez. The CDO market, which stood at 275 billion in 2000, grew to 4.7 trillion by 2006. At the heart of it all was Lee's formula. To put it succinctly, Lee's formula was a way of adding yet another multi-layered ability to create credit and interest, an alchemical operation, out of literally nothing. Oh, I love math. There was also another hidden danger in Lee's formula, and that was that even for those financial institutions that did take into consideration historical data, there was not much historical data to go on, for the simple reason that credit default swaps had been in existence less than a decade during which house prices. Indeed, Lee's formula had the effect, as already has been seen, of inflating such bundling exponentially and contributing to the creation of bundles with literally millions of potential correlated factors, none of which, it bears repeating, were based on historical data of anything more than a few years' duration. And this reveals another flaw in the formula and its application to securities correlations and their ratings. For implicit in the technique was a hidden assumption that correlation was more of a constant than a variable. That is, while the individual components of such bundles were variable, their correlation was not. Consequently, by abandoning historical data and by relying upon this hidden assumption of correlation constancy, the model could not cope with any sudden downturn in prices, such as occurred in the housing market and mortgage sectors. In short, the whole technique had abandoned the well and commonly known fact that economic activity, for whatever reason, seems to occur in repeated cycles of growth and decline, or, if one prefer, of boom and bust. And this knowledge of cycles, as will be seen, there also lies quite a tale, and a carefully hidden one at that. Suspiciously, Dr. Lee, after publishing his formula, returned to China in 2008 and has been curiously silent during the causes and culprits behind the crash. But in the ultimate twist to the story, he has returned to Beijing, where he is in charge of the Risk Management Department of China International Capital Corporation. This raises disturbing possibilities, not the least of which was that the whole episode might conceivably have been a form of economic warfare, but by whom and against whom? Whatever the answer is or whatever the answer to that question may be, and it is not as apparent as it might seem, it is clear that Dr. Lee's formula would provide the necessary mathematical technique and technology to anyone inclined to wage such economic warfare, particularly if such persons or groups were in the possession of historical or other data that indicated an inevitable economic downturn were coming, and who, seeking to worsen it for their own purposes, used Lee's formula to create the correlatives or derivatives bubble of bundles and credit swaps, a bubble that would pop when the inevitable fall in prices occurred. As will be seen in Chapter 2, there is precisely such data available, and it did indicate an inevitable cyclic economic downturn would begin around 2000 to 2006. I might mention, before continuing, that that's also a prediction that Robert Kiyosaki has made in his books based on his rich dad's assessment of lots of things. So this is starting to become very interesting, and makes me also wonder about a lot of the stuff that Kiyosaki was saying. A lot of this stuff is being pulled together. It's really, really very interesting. Kiyosaki's been warning us about this shit for years, and also this book by Joseph P. Farrell, Babylon's Banksters, was published in 2010, just a little bit after that crash happened, from 2007 to about 2009. Wow, there's so many interesting things here. This is starting to come together. I'm digging it. I'm digging the intrigue. I'm digging the secrecy here. This guy, he's a good storyteller, Joseph P. Farrell. No wonder I like his books. One of his first books I read was actually called The Cosmic War, Modern Physics in Ancient Texts, where he talks about how a scalar resonance weapon destroyed an entire planet. I'll leave you to look up. I don't want to get too geeked out about it because I get excited about that book, which led me to so many other authors and things like that because of the the stuff that's in it. Christopher Birkenbein says, I really I really need to say that I'm digging the Barnes & Noble background music during your talk. It adds warmth to the talk. Yeah. The reading, yes, it's fun. What is the name of that group? Take on me. All right, so let's see. Continuing, 2, the Lee clan, the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, and the Triads. Ooh, it's getting juicy here, huh? But that is not all there is to the David Lee story. This part of the story, however, appears to have been carefully hidden from the public for reasons that will become apparent in a moment. As noted above, among Dr. Lee's many career moves and positions, he began to work for Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce in 1997, moving from there to Barclays in 2004. Thus, when his paper with the notorious formula on default correlation, a copula approach, was published in 2000, Lee still worked for Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. This reveals some interesting possible connections. As most people know, these names actually begin with the surname followed by the individual's proper name. Thus, my name, following the Chinese custom, would be Farrell Joseph rather than Joseph Farrell. More importantly, the name Lee is a fairly common surname in China, like the name Smith or Brown would be in the USA, Britain, or Canada. People with a common surname do not therefore imply any blood relation, and people with the same surname are often strangers to each other. The same holds true for China, but with one significant exception. In Chinese culture, people with the same surname, regardless of whether there are blood ties or not, are regarded by the Chinese as coming from the same family, or clan. Thus, two Chinese strangers with the same surname will more often than not regard each other differently than two strangers with different surnames. They will, to a certain extent, regard each other as part of a very large family, extending to each other the customs and courtesies common between family members. I can say this with a little bit of truth from one experience that I have where a woman that I was dating had the name Zhang as her surname, Zhang Minghui, and then the owner, teacher of several businesses, and one of them being an English school out there, which a friend of mine, Chase, worked for. Her name was Zhang Kathy. which I don't remember her actual real Chinese given name, but when they met each other and I mentioned that they both had the name Zhang, their whole demeanor changed with each other. So I can say that from at least one experience. And then Ming Hui had her given name in common with another Ming Hui who owned another restaurant that I used to go to all the time. So some interesting stuff. Okay, so extending to each other the customs and courtesies common between family members. And this places Dr. David X. Lee into a very different potential interpretive context. For at the same time as he was employed by the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce and authoring his now notorious paper, a fellow Klansman, one Li Kai-shing, owned a significant block of that bank's stock. But who is Li Kai-shing? He is one of Hong Kong's most famous billionaires who, along with his sons Victor and Richard, assumed significant governmental posts to aid in the transition of Hong Kong from a British colony back to Chinese jurisdiction. Li Kai-shing's financial empire stretched through Asia's media and financial markets, and even more significantly, another Li, Li Qiang, was at one time head of Red China's China International Trust and Investment Corporation, in charge basically of China's foreign trade with the West, and particularly with the United States and Canada. After Dr. David Lee left the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce in 2004, Li Kai-shing sold his stake in the bank the very next year. That's interesting. It's interesting. I also know somebody personally, I'm not going to even mention their name at this point in time, who works for the government of Canada, and she happens to be Chinese, and I think I'm not going to mention her other parents' ethnicity, and just some of the interesting things about like Huawei and their one of their executives being detained in Canada for a long time, and then while I was in China, a few Canadian nationals that were there, one of them was held for espionage and put in prison and all these other things that seemed to be some retaliatory things, but then was released when the woman who worked for Huawei or the other technology company that was being held in Canada was released. And she was being held by Canada on behalf of the United States government. And it was a really weird and messy situation that was going on between those things. So I find a lot of this stuff interesting. And what else pointed out to me here? There was something else. Imperial Bank, Klansman, 7 Block Bank stock, Hong Kong's most famous billionaires, Richard, colony, jurisdiction, Li Qiang, Red China, but let me continue. It'll probably come to me again because there's a lot of things that I observed while I was there that were fascinating. Not even this, however, begins to plumb the depths of the importance of the Li clan in China, for the clan has had several emperors, including Emperor Li Zhuanshu, who reigned before 2000 BC. Additionally, a Li founded the Tang Dynasty from 618 that lasted from 618 to 906 AD. Most significantly, the Li clan appears to have been involved with financial wheeling and dealing from an early time, being the same clan that introduced paper money to China during the same Tang Dynasty. Wow. This is something that I also learned that China was one of the, in other books that I read, that China was the first place to introduce paper money. I think it's mentioned in a book that I have, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, and in both of the books, one on the Little Book of Economics and How Money Works. So this has some backing in books that are at least regarded as nonfiction, which this book, Joseph P. Farrell, is putting forward as, of course, a piece of it's nonfiction, but might be regarded as more serious because they're written by academics and, serious institutions of study and academia in Europe and whatnot. So there's correlation that I've seen there that this is true from those other cross-references and financial books I've been reading. So that, that China was one of the first to use paper money, and then it was later taken upon by other countries afterwards, which is known as a fiat currency. So, continuing. So we now have the following intriguing latticework of relationships. 1. An old and influential Chinese clan very much involved in government and finance from early Chinese history. 2. the same clan involved in the same activities millennia later. And 3, one member of the clan develops the formula that led to the current meltdown. And far from being dismissed as a competent risk assessor by the Chinese, he returns to China to a post doing precisely what his formula was designed to do: assess risk. All this, of course, places David X. Lee's return to Red China and assumption of a position in a Chinese corporation concerned with overseas trade, and once again in a position where he is assessing risk, into a very interesting context, making it unlikely that his and namesake Li Ka-shing's departure from the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce were coincidental. So again, all of this, of course, places David X. Lee's return to Red China and assumption of a post in a Chinese corporation concerned with overseas trade, and once again in a position where he is assessing risk, into very interesting context, making it unlikely that his and namesake Li Ka-shing's departure from the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce were coincidental. Unlikely that those things are coincidental. But not even this tells the whole tale of the Li clan. The Li clan is one of the principal families which has controlled the notorious Chinese criminal secret society, the Triads. According to researcher Fritz Springmeier, the following Lis have been leaders of various sections of the Triads. Li Chitang, overseas leader. Li Xiangqi. Li Sucheng, Hunan. Li Hong, Honan. Li Kai-qian, Shanghai. Li Lapting, Guangxi Province. Li Pingqing, Triad, Shanghai. Li Xiqin, Li Wenmao, north of Peking, Fatshan. Li Yuanfa, Hunan. Li Choifat, Hong Kong. And Li Jafar Ma, Britain. Choifat, interesting. And just what are the Triads? They are a Chinese criminal secret society deeply connected with the opium trade, the practice of Chinese occult activities, and they are, in Springmeier's apt description, something of a cross between the Masons and the Mafia, something in the line of P2 Freemasonry, except much bigger. Indeed, some estimates put the membership of the Triads and similar Oriental secret societies as close to 2 million, if not more. Thus, the possibility that the entire current meltdown was a covert act of economic warfare looms rather large, especially given the fact that the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce is also known to have some strong ties to the Rothschild banking interest. In short, we have clear indications of the possibility that China has signaled that it is not simply going to be a subservient player in whatever New World Order schemes the Anglo-American wishes to implement and impose on the rest of the world. In this respect, it is important to observe the pattern that the Li clan typifies. And just taking a break real quick, knowing also that BRICS is happening in 4 days, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and 30 or so other countries meeting to talk about proposing perhaps a new currency backed by gold, which would take it away from being a fiat currency, which interestingly enough was one of the things that China originally introduced with paper money back in the day. So some interesting things also coming forward now having to do with China and money, very specifically finance. So interesting coincidence. So in this respect, it is important to observe the pattern that the Li clan typifies. 1. The clan is ancient, with strong ties going back millennia, both to government and finance. 2. The clan is moreover connected with a secret society, whose activities in turn are A. Occult religious activity. B. Criminal business organization and activity. C. Assassinations, blackmail, and infiltration of government and finance. 3. The clan is clearly connected to a mathematical model of economic activity, implying a hidden interest in developing such formally explicit models. And finally, 4. That model is the culprit responsible for the current economic meltdown, which has affected primarily the institutions of the Anglo-American financial elite. As will be seen, Such activities and patterns or relationships are not unique to the present or previous century. They are, in fact, as the Lee clan itself evidences, millennia old and firmly rooted within the history of human civilizations and their banking class. However, the consistency of this behavior and this constellation of relationships is rooted in something more, and certainly nothing less than human nature or greed, or even the predictable actions of a particular socioeconomic class. That something else lies in a little-noticed connection between physics and finance that is as old as man's fascination with the stars, and with what good or ill fortunes they might portend. And that is also to say that there has been since ancient times a profound connection between physics and economics, and a struggle between those who view both as closed systems and those who view both as open systems. We shall call those who adhere to the closed system of physics and finance by the term banksters, to indicate the chimerical and criminal hybrids of gangster and banker. These people are indeed driven by an almost boundless lust for power, by a criminal greed and wanton disregard of the humanity they wish to enslave. But they are also driven by a knowledge of certain hidden things, among them the profound relationship between physics and finance. Also something very interesting, which I've spoken about several times here before on Wisdom and other places, is that I actually came to an interesting conclusion when I was living in China, with the fact that I was handling bills with hundreds on them, the 100 yuan bills at a time, usually going to the bank and pulling out 10 of them at a time, which was 1,000 yuan. And I had this thought that it would somehow affect the way that I handled and dealt with money coming back to the United States. Whereas, like, by handling so many bills, sometimes anywhere between 1,000 and 10,000 at a time in cash, that it would affect the way that I saw money here, because even though they're a different color, they still had 100 on, and they were the official currency of the country. So I figured that by handling it more, I just had this idea that it would cause me to also be able to change the way that I thought about money, to be able to get more Benjamin, so to speak, here in the U.S. And there were actually several other things that I read here on Wisdom and elsewhere by people like Dan Kennedy. But one of the things that was interesting is that as I was trying to figure this out, I was on an app called Breakout, and there was a woman in there who worked for several different banking institutions and things around the world. And when I had started talking about this, I told her that, yeah, I have this idea for some reason now that I'm back in the United States, like it causes me to be more aware of and more open to receiving money in the denominations of hundreds of dollars, specifically in hundreds of dollars of bills. And she mentioned to me that she said there's a whole study about that. And guess what it's called? It's called economic physics. So I thought that was interesting. That's an interesting connection. Now that I'm reading this, it just brought that to my mind. So anyway, there's, and it happened while I was in China. So let's see. And going to number 3, China's money. There is a little known to China's booming economy that Western financiers, economists, and media mandarins are loath to discuss. And that is that China's money is created by China and not borrowed from private bankers. In effect, this means China's money is debt-free. In short, Communist China has followed the precedent established by the American Federal Constitution, where the money-creating and issuing power lies with the Congress, that is, with the state. As Ellen Hodgson Brown observed in her magisterial book on the whole problem of central private banking monopolies on money issuance, Web of Debt, the key difference in China's system, and that prevailing in most other nations, is its banking system. China has a government-issued currency and a system of national banks that are actually owned by the nation. According to Wikipedia... Yes, thank you, sir. Barnes & Noble will be closing in 20 minutes. The key difference in China's system, and that prevailing in most other nations, is its banking system. China has a government-issued currency and a system of national banks that are actually owned by the nation. According to Wikipedia, the People's Bank of China is unusual in acting as a national bank, focusing on the country, not on the currency. The notion of national banking, as opposed to private central banking, goes back to Lincoln, Carey, and the American nationalists. Henry C.K. Leo distinguishes the two systems like this. A national bank serves the interest of the nation and its people. A central bank serves the interests of private international finance. Even though China's currency, the yuan, is pegged to the dollar in terms of its exchange rate value, China's banking system is testament to the fact that its government has seen what politicians and a great deal of its people formally understood, namely that when a private bank creates money, it only creates the principal, not the interest. When a state, on the other hand, creates money, it has the ability to expand the money supply according to the credit needs of the nation. In short, when a nation's money represents a principle on which interest is owed, someone always comes out the loser, since there is never enough money in circulation to repay the debt interest, and thus a national debt can never be repaid. It can only grow. Contrariwise, when a nation's money represents a receipt for goods and services rendered and is issued interest-free by the state itself, that state can experience almost total employment, and there is no built-in principle of debt and scarcity. It is these two systems, where money is created by a private monopoly in limited supply, which represents an interest-bearing debt note, or where money is created by the state as a receipt for goods and services and is debt-free, that are the two systems which have contended against each other throughout history. In the former system, the system of money in circulation is closed, and there is never as much money in circulation as there is debt, and hence scarcity becomes the order of the day, as limited supplies of money compete for limited goods, resources, and energy. In the latter system, the system of money is open and can expand, as the economy whose goods and services it represents as receipts expands with it. In terms of the analogy to physics, the former system can never function at over unity, whereas in the latter system, it must function as such. Again, I was just talking about this today, about open and closed systems, about the universe earlier today, how I am not able conceptually in my mind to imagine a finite or closed universe completely, as I see that maybe there's a closed system, but it's within an open system, to put it very succinctly or as simply as I can. Let's see. It looks like there might be a lot more here to read before I even get to chapter 2, so I might have to shut down in a moment. Let me just read to another section. It's starting to get kind of juicy here, right? Of course, every book, what's so funny is what's coming up here. All right. Continuing. This is C. Nazi Germany, Physics and Finance Fully Rationalized. I'll read for about 10 more minutes. This relationship between finance and physics was, in modern times, first clearly perceived by that nation which not only established state-created debt-free money, but which also sponsored a variety of secret research projects into free energy physics and technologies, Nazi Germany. When World War I ended and the Allies imposed war reparations on defeated Germany, the total reparations to be paid exceeded the value of all the property in Germany by 3 times. Anyone who has studied the history knows the story. Germany hyperinflated its currency, paying off the Allies with increasingly worthless Reichsmarks and destroying Germany's economy in the process. But it is to be noted, these Reichsmarks were still the issuances of a privately controlled bank, and thus Germany's debt situation only compounded dramatically. That's another thing also mentioned, fully showed with photos and everything in the book The Capitalist Manifesto by Robert Kiyosaki, where he shows stacks and stacks of billions and billions of dollars being played with and by kids and burned by people because it was completely useless. And that's in his book. It's pretty interesting. I'm seeing a lot of parallels. I wonder if he read this book by Joseph P. Farrell. I mean, but the thing is, I don't think so. I just think that when you're following money like this, you come to see a lot of the same things when you're studying money, and that's what these people are doing. And it's interesting. It's very interesting just to see it. Let me see, what did I just pass here? Chapter 17 in the Capitalist Manifesto is Be the Fed. I'm far from the only one supporting this battle cry. Don't fight the Fed, be the Fed. And it says the fake Fed. Financial experts say don't fight the Fed. I say the Fed is fake. So is the Fed chairman. Rather than don't fight the Fed, I prefer to be the Fed. I say the Fed chairman is the Wizard of Oz. I say that because just like the wizard in the Wizard of Oz, the Fed has no power. I wrote about that in an article for Jet Set magazine in 2020. Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. There's a question in here. So are you saying the shadow banking system has more power than the Fed? Answer, yes, much more power because the shadow banking system is much bigger and does not have to follow the Fed's rules. Man, Capitalist Manifesto. Right, but let's return to Babylon's Banksters by Joseph P. Farrell. Okay, so Germany's debt was compounded dramatically. Hitler's Reichsbank president, Dr. Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht, let the big secret out in his 1967 book, The Magic of Money. The mark's dramatic devaluation began soon after the Reichsbank was privatized or delivered into private investors. What drove the wartime inflation to hyperinflation, said Schacht, was speculation by foreign investors who would sell the mark short, betting on its decreasing value. Speculation in the German mark was made possible because the Reichsbank made massive amounts of currency available for borrowing, marks that were created on demand and lent at profitable interest to the bank. When the Reichsbank could not keep up with the voracious demand for marks, other private investment banks were allowed to create them out of nothing and lend them at interest as well. The German government was not responsible for the post-war hyperinflation. It was Germany's privately owned central bank and its monopoly on the country's money creation. Money created as a circulating note of debt that created the problem. Germany's economy was crashed and devastated by the bankers. And I'm going to leave it right there because I got to go eat, and it's going to take me a moment to pack up these books I have here. And then start reading later after I eat some food. But you've been listening to World Reading Club, presented by Hakeem Ali Bokus Alexander, here on Wisdom, Social Audio Inc., and Spreaker, Social Podcasting. Presented for World Reading Club in association with UniquilibriuM. This edition's reading focus has come to us from Babylon's Banksters by Joseph P. Farrell. Deep Physics, The Alchemy of Deep Physics, High Finance, and Ancient Religion. When I come back later after my belly is full, I'm going to start again with C, where Nazi Germany, physics and finance fully rationalized.